Either party to this partnership may, upon 60 days' written notice to the other, require the other party to purchase his interest at a price equal to the net book value of his proportionate share of all partnership assets, as determined by the partnership accountant, or, at the electing party's sole option, require the dissolution and liquidation of all partnership assets, with proceeds to be distributed in proportion to each party's ownership interest. And Farm Partnership Agreement, Dawson County, Nebraska, executed June 14, 1969. Either party, 60 days notice, net book value on or liquidation. The clause had been written to protect both brothers. In 1969, it had read as a symmetrical exit provision, a mechanism that either partner could use if the partnership became unworkable, ensuring that no one was trapped indefinitely in a business relationship that had failed. Each brother could demand his interest back. Each was protected from being held against his will in a deteriorating arrangement. In 1969, this seemed fair. In 1984, the younger brother filed the notice. The older brother had 60 days to find $142,000 in cash, or accept the liquidation of everything the partnership had built in 15 years. He did not have $142,000. The clause that had been written to protect both brothers had become the instrument that threatened to destroy what one of them had spent his adult life building. Martin and Carl Strecker had grown up on their father's farm in Dawson County, Nebraska. 320 acres of corn and alfalfa ground in the Platte River Valley that their father had purchased in 1948 and farmed through the 1950s and 1960s. When their father retired in 1969, he passed the operation to both sons equally rather than choosing between them. The arrangement made intuitive sense. Both sons had worked the farm, both had contributed labor and knowledge, and dividing the farm between them seemed more fair than designating one as the primary heir. Martin was 34 in 1969. He had been farming the Dawson County ground alongside his father since he returned from military service in 1958. He was the day-to-day operator, the one who made the planting decisions, managed the equipment, hired the seasonal labor, and knew the farm's soil patterns well enough to anticipate yield variation across the different fields. Carl was 29 and had been less consistently involved. He had worked at a grain elevator in Cozad through the mid-1960s and had returned to the farm only in 1967, 2 years before the transition. Their father had consulted an attorney in Lexington about how to structure the transfer. The attorney had recommended a formal partnership agreement rather than a simple co-ownership arrangement, a documented framework that specified each partner's obligations, the decision-making structure, and critically, the mechanisms by which either partner could exit the arrangement if it became necessary. The buyout clause was the attorney's standard provision for farm partnerships. It was designed to address the most common failure mode, a situation where the partner's relationship deteriorated to the point where one wanted out. The clause gave each partner an exit right without requiring the other's consent. He could demand buyout at book value, or he could demand liquidation if the other partner was unable or unwilling to buy him out at that price. Martin and Carl had signed the agreement in June 1969. The partnership farmed the original 320 acres and over the following years expanded, purchasing an additional 160 acres in 1973 and renting another 240 acres on a cash lease beginning in 1975. By the early 1980s, the Strecker Partnership was operating a 720-acre corn and alfalfa operation with equipment valued on the books at approximately $180,000 and real property equity, the two owned parcels, reflected at purchase price minus depreciation. The partnership accountant, a man in Cozad named Albert Norris, maintained the books on the accrual basis. Net book value of the partnership's assets, as of the end of 1983, was $567,000. Divided equally, Carl's half was $283,500. The buyout clause, however, specified net book value of Carl's proportionate share. The partnership agreement defined this as the book value of Carl's interest after accounting for his share of outstanding partnership liabilities. After subtracting Carl's proportionate share of the partnership's operating line and equipment notes, his net buyable interest was $142,000. $142,000. This was the number the clause had always pointed to, though no one had calculated it precisely since the 1969 signing. The number had changed each year as assets were added, debts were incurred and retired, and the accountant maintained his records. In 1984, when Carl's situation changed in ways no one had anticipated in 1969, the number that came out of the formula was $142,000. Carl's situation had been deteriorating since 1981. He had purchased a house in Cozad in 1978 using a home equity loan and had taken on additional personal debt in 1979 and 1980 related to a small implement rental business he had started outside the partnership. The implement business had not performed as he had projected. By 1982, it was generating losses, and by 1983, Carl was carrying personal debt separate from the partnership that his income could not service adequately. His share of the partnership's income had been declining with commodity prices through the early 1980s. The corn market had fallen sharply from its 1981 highs, and the partnership's margins had compressed correspondingly. Carl's income from the partnership in 1983 was approximately $18,000, his half of the net operating income after debt service. Against his personal obligations, that income was insufficient. Carl consulted an attorney in Grand Island in the fall of 1983. He needed to restructure his personal financial position. His options included refinancing his personal debt, selling assets, or liquidating his most significant asset, his partnership interest. The attorney reviewed the 1969 partnership agreement and identified the buyout clause. Carl could demand buyout from Martin at net book value, $142,000, with 60 days' notice. If Martin could not or would not pay $142,000, Carl could elect the liquidation option, which would force the dissolution and sale of all partnership assets, with proceeds divided equally. Carl sent the notice in January 1984. Martin received the certified letter at the farm address on January 19, 1984. He drove to Albert Norris's office in Cozad that afternoon and asked Norris to calculate what $142,000 meant in practical terms. Norris pulled the partnership books and ran the numbers. The figure was accurate. Carl's net book value interest, after his proportionate share of the partnership's liabilities, was $142,000 as of the most recent year-end. Martin then asked Norris what the partnership's assets would bring if liquidated at current market prices. This was a different question from the book value question, and its answer was different in ways that mattered enormously in January 1984. The partnership's two owned parcels, the original 320 acres and the 1973 edition, had been carried on the books at purchase price, less depreciation on improvements. The land itself was not depreciated. Book value of the land reflected the purchase prices, $168,000 for the original 320 acres purchased in 1969 and $72,000 for the 1973 edition. Total book value of the real property, $240,000. Market value of the same real property in January 1984 was substantially lower. Dawson County farmland had peaked in 1981 at values that had roughly doubled the late 1970s prices and had been declining since. By January 1984, comparable ground in the Platte River Valley was trading at prices that put the two owned parcels at approximately $310,000 in market value. Below book in some respects, due to the complexity of how improvements and land value interacted, but above book in terms of raw land value. The equipment was a different story. The partnership's equipment inventory, carried at approximately $180,000 on the books after depreciation, would bring substantially less at a distressed farm equipment auction in 1984. The market for used farm equipment had been soft since 1982, as farmers across the Midwest had been liquidating equipment to raise cash. Norris estimated the equipment would bring $95,000 to $110,000 at auction, $70,000 to $85,000 below book value. A liquidation of all partnership assets in January 1984 would generate proceeds substantially different from what the book value numbers suggested. The land would sell near book. The equipment would sell well below book. The net available for distribution after satisfying all partnership liabilities might be $180,000 to $200,000. Divided equally, Carl would receive $90,000 to $100,000. Carl had filed the buyout notice demanding $142,000. A liquidation would likely yield him $90,000 to $100,000. Martin asked why Carl had filed the notice at $142,000 if liquidation would yield him less. Norris explained that the buyout clause gave Carl the choice. $142,000 from Martin at book value, or liquidation with unknown proceeds. Carl had filed the notice knowing that if Martin could pay $142,000, that was the better outcome for Carl. If Martin could not pay, Carl would elect liquidation and take whatever the market provided, less than $142,000, but money he needed now. Martin's choice was not between $142,000 and a better number. It was between $142,000 and a forced liquidation of the farm at 1984 prices. Martin retained an attorney in Lexington named Douglas Haney, who had handled farm business matters in Dawson County for 18 years. Haney reviewed the 1969 partnership agreement and the buyout notice. He confirmed that Carl had exercised the clause correctly. The notice had been properly given. The 60-day period had begun running, and the clause's terms were unambiguous. Martin had 60 days to pay $142,000 or accept liquidation. Martin asked whether there was any basis to challenge the timing of the notice, whether Carl's financial distress constituted grounds for some equitable intervention that would give Martin more time or different terms. Haney told him there was not. The clause did not condition the buyout right on any particular financial circumstance of the electing partner. It was available to either party at any time for any reason on 60 days' notice. Carl's financial distress was why he had exercised it, but it was not a condition of his right to exercise it. The right was unconditional. Martin asked what $142,000 looked like in terms of available financing. Haney told him that was the question Martin needed to answer quickly, because 60 days was not a long time to arrange financing of that scale in early 1984. Martin spent the following 3 weeks pursuing every financing option available to him. He approached the partnership's existing agricultural lender in Cozad about a loan against his own interest in the partnership assets. The lender reviewed the partnership's books and the current market conditions and offered to lend $90,000, not $142,000, because the lender's appraisal of the collateral using current market values rather than book values did not support a larger loan. He contacted a second lender in Kearney with the same result. The book value of the buyout obligation was $142,000. The market value of the collateral available to support it was approximately $90,000 to $100,000. No lender was willing to bridge the gap between those two numbers in early 1984. To understand why the 1969 clause had produced this outcome, it helps to understand the relationship between net book value and market value, and why a partnership buyout clause written around book value can create obligations that the remaining partner cannot meet when market values and book values diverge. Net book value is an accounting concept. It reflects the cost of assets, adjusted for depreciation, minus outstanding liabilities. It is a number that accounting records can produce consistently and objectively. When partners write a buyout clause pegged to book value, they are choosing a calculation method that is clear, auditable, and not subject to dispute. Any accountant can produce the number from the partnership's records. Market value is what the assets would bring in an arm's length transaction. It reflects supply and demand, current conditions, and the specific characteristics of the assets. Market value is less predictable and more subject to negotiation, which is why parties often prefer book value as a buyout formula. It removes the need for an appraisal and eliminates disputes about valuation. The problem arises when book value and market value diverge significantly, particularly when market value is lower than book value in some asset categories, as farm equipment consistently was in 1984. But the book value obligation is calculated on assets where the divergence goes the other way. The 1969 clause had been written when book value and market value were reasonably close for farm assets. No one in 1969 had anticipated a period in which farm equipment would lose 60% of its book value in a distressed market, while the book value buyout obligation remained fixed at 1983 accounting figures. A clause written for orderly exit assumes an orderly market. When the market becomes disorderly, the clause does not adjust. It executes the formula that was written in 1969 and produces an obligation in 1984 that the remaining partner cannot meet from the assets available to him. Martin was unable to arrange $142,000 in financing before the 60-day period expired. Carl elected the liquidation option. The partnership's assets were liquidated through a combination of a private sale of the real property and an equipment auction conducted in the spring of 1984. The 480 owned acres sold to a neighboring farm operation at $325,000, above Martin's expectations, reflecting the continued interest of cash buyers even in a declining market. The equipment auction brought $98,000. After satisfying all partnership liabilities, the net proceeds available for distribution were $201,000. Carl received $100,500. Martin received $100,500. Martin had spent 15 years building the Dawson County operation. He had been the day-to-day farmer, the one who had made the operational decisions, managed the soil, and maintained the ground. After the liquidation, he had $100,500 and no farm to operate. He rented ground in Dawson County through the rest of the 1980s, rebuilding on a smaller scale. He did not own farmland again until 1991, when he purchased 160 acres from an estate with the proceeds he had accumulated in the intervening years. Carl retired his personal debt with his liquidation proceeds and sold his implement business at a loss in 1985. Neither brother had done anything the 1969 agreement had not contemplated. The clause had been designed to give each partner an exit. It had given Carl his exit. It had given Martin an exit he had not sought and could not prevent. The agreement had been fair in 1969. In 1984, fair was not the same as safe. The agreement gave both brothers an exit. In 1984, that exit became a trap.